let's talk about vector, its basic concept, key terms, and vector addition. So starting with a vector. So what is a vector? Vector is a quantity that has both direction and magnitude. So direction means you have a line with an arrow, and then magnitude is the length. So let's say we have, try to draw two vectors. So we have a vector v. So vector v is AB, and then vector u is CD. So A is the initial point and B is the terminal point for vector v, and then for vector u, C is the initial point and then D is the terminal point. So initial point we call it the tail of the vector, and then the terminal point we call it the P of a vector. So when you draw a vector, don't just draw a line, because for a vector the direction is important. You have to give me an arrow to tell me which direction you are going, and then the length of the vector is also important. But in the vector language, we don't use the word length, because length is not a technical word. We use the word magnitude. So every time we talk about magnitude, we are talking about the length of a vector. So vector, direction, arrow, and length. So for vector AB, so you have a vector and then vector u. So actually there is a little minor mistake right there, and then the first one is supposed to be vector u. So let me correct that real quick. It's not a huge deal. So the first one is vector v, the second one is vector u. So just correct that real quick. And then if vector v is equals to vector u, then they have the same length. So when you write vector v, so this is very important, because you are trying to switch around between a set of written notes and a book, right? So take a look at the blue handwriting. So when we write a vector, and this is very important, please don't make this mistake and don't create this confusion on your writing. So when you write a vector v, so you are supposed to write a v, and then you draw an arrow on top of a v. So when people read your work, read your handwriting, they see a v and then they see an arrow on top of v, they know that v stands for vector. But how do textbook do this? So when textbook type vector v, they won't type the arrow for you. They will just type a vector v, but will put the v in bold. So when they type the v in the textbook, they say vector v, they are not going to put, sometimes they are not going to put an arrow on top of the v, they will just put the v in bold. So a lowercase letter v will be in bold. So when you see the lowercase letter is in bold in the textbook, that represents a vector. So when you see vector v, vector u, vector w in bold, so that means they make the v really dark and bold. So that means a vector. And then there is a zero vector. So zero vector is just a zero. So the length of this vector is equals to 0, and zero vector has no direction. Now, how to combine a vector? So let's say we have a particle moving from point A to point B, and then at point B, the particle change direction and then move to point C. So this one, let's draw this. So from point A to point B, so we start at A. So this is point A, and then we draw a point to point B, and then we draw a point. So from point A to point B, so we know that there is a direction, right? The direction is you go from point A from point B, just like you go from home to school. So from point A to point B, you draw a line, and what's next? You draw an arrow. So because this is a vector, you have to give me an arrow. So how do you write vector AB on your paper? You write AB, and then you put an arrow on top of it. So that stands for vector AB. And then change direction. All right, let's change to another direction, and then we go to point C. So how about this? We change direction, and then we go to point C. So this is my terminal point, and then arrow. So that is my point C. And then we have a vector BC. And then the vector AB and BC, they are called displacement vector. And then how do you add them? So let's say I want to add a vector AB plus vector BC. So that is equals to vector AC. And then how do you draw vector AC? Let's switch another color for that. So vector AC is from A to C. So we have that. So that is vector AC. All right, so that's how you combine two vectors. And then on the next page, I would like to talk about vector addition, because we will be using that a lot. So for vector addition, if vector u and vector v, again, when you read vector addition on a textbook, the u and the v will be in bold. When you write vector u and v, please put an arrow on top of u and v. This is not optional. It's very important. It's not optional. It's either you like it or you don't. I'm not asking if you like it or not. When you handwrite your math, let vector u and vector v, please put an arrow on top of u and on top of v. That tells me that it's a vector. Otherwise, the u and v looks more like a variable. And there is a huge difference between a variable and a vector. All right, back to this addition problem. If vector u and vector v are vectors positioned so the initial point v is at the terminal point of u, then the sum u plus v is the vector from the initial point of u to the initial point of v. Alright, so here for the vector u and v, so I can also put an arrow like that. So when you add those two vectors from the initial point of u to the initial point of v, so we have two laws. So the first one is a triangle law. So what happened in here is I have a vector u, so that goes from one point to another point, and then vector v is at the initial point of vector v, which is right here. So this big blue point is the initial point of vector v, right? So this initial point is at the terminal point of vector u. So I have go from u to v, and then u now is done, and then I change direction to draw a vector v, and then how do you add them? The u plus v is just a pink line that goes from u to v. So since this looks like a triangle, then we call this a triangle law. All right, and then there is another case. The other case is you go from one point to another in vector u. Of course, I have to draw this arrow. So now we go from the starting point, this big blue point. From this point to the terminal point, I have a vector u, and then I change my direction. I have my vector v, and then the pink line is vector u plus v. That is straight from the triangle law, right? And then I can do an alternative. The alternative is I go to v first. So v, so look at the yellow vector v. So that is from u to v, you have a vector v, and then from v you change the direction, you have a vector u, and then to add v and u, do you see that I can just go ahead and then draw this yellow line, right? So that is vector v plus vector u. So I just put a yellow line on top of a pink line. So that is letter v plus u. So overall, this is called the parallelogram law. All right, so that is the end of this video. In the next video, I will show you how to I will show you more about vectors. So I will see you all in the next video. Signing off for now.